Hello, everybody. Thank you for this chance to deliver the lecture again. I'm afraid you're going to hear some more about the background to how I got interested in search theory and how I cooperated with my co-winners. I'll take you back. I hope it's not too boring for you, but it might be useful, who knows. Here you see the first set of subtitles that I will have in this in this talk. I'm going to tell you how I got into search theory, then I'm going to get into the mechanics of the search process we've assumed, and then I'm going to put everything together into an equilibrium model of the economy. And there will be some more Beverage Curve exhibits, I'm afraid, but hopefully put into different use than the one you've had so far. Okay, let me begin then about how I got into search theory. It was in 1969, when my co-winners were already active researchers in this area. I was in the final year of my degree at the University of Essex in England, and my university had an exchange agreement with Northwestern University, where there were many great economists interested in search theory at that time working at Northwestern. And one of my lecturers came back from a visit at Northwestern that year, and he brought with him a copy of a book which had the title Microeconomic Foundations of Employment and Inflation Theory. It was co-authored by Edmund Phelps and others. He told me that that book was going to be very important in the years to come, because there's a lot of discussion about the book in the United States. It was introduced, it was based mainly on this new theory which is called search theory. He also said that one of the contributors to that book was visiting the University of Essex, and I should talk to him, and of course I went to talk to him, and that turned out to be Dale Mortensen. We had an interesting discussion about it as a student. He told me what a great theory this was going to be. He also told me what a great place Northwestern was going to be to do my PhD, but he just couldn't persuade me to do that because I thought it was too cold to go to Chicago to do a PhD. That wouldn't mean anything to you, I guess, here, but for a young Cypriot boy, it meant a lot. Now, Robert Clower, another great Northwestern economist at the time, was also visiting Essex, and he was talking about Axel Leonhufvud's book, who was his PhD student from Sweden, as you might know, with title On Keynesian Economics and the Economics of Keynes. Now, the book by Phelps claimed that search theory provided the micro foundations for inflation and employment trade-off for the Phillips curve and the natural rate of unemployment, and the Leonhufvud book claimed that search theory could provide the foundations for Keynes's ideas of effective demand. So that sounded very exciting, because it sounded like it was going to bring together the two big branches of macroeconomics at the time. So obviously, as a new PhD student, I mean, that was a perfect, interested in macro, that was a perfect topic to get into and to research. As you might know, as you heard from the previous two speakers, and you also hear from me, I think the search theory really succeeded in things other than the inflation and employment rate, other than the Phillips curve or Keynes' effective demand. But that's the nature of research. Now, the Phelps volume had many great papers in it. My main interest was in the first part of the book, with papers by Armen Alchian, Charles Holt, where they were describing in detail the process by which individuals look and find jobs when there is imperfect information, and then by papers by Phelps and Mortensen, that they were putting them together into a theory of the Phillips curve. And my idea was to work harder on the micro foundations of those papers and introduce price and wage stickiness to get Keynesian results. And I did write a book on that based on my PhD thesis at the London School of Economics, which was entitled Labor Market Adjustment, Microeconomic Foundations of Short-Run Neoclassical and Keynesian Dynamics. And the commercial closes here. Now, let's move on to the second subtitle, now searching for what. Now I felt at the time that there were still many unanswered questions in the Phelps volume, as there were about the foundations of Keynesian economics, and the most important were about wage determination. That they don't there did not seem to be compelling reasons in the search model for either wage differentials, something that Peter, of course, independently expanded a lot, and also Michael Rothschild, I should say, expanded on when he reviewed the book. And I also felt that there weren't enough reasons to justify wage stickiness. But there seemed to be compelling reasons to assume that wages were subject to monopolistic influences. But that, of course, was still a long way from showing that there were wage differentials or wage stickiness. Now, to me, at that time, search theory was appealing as a foundation of the theory of unemployment because it appeared realistic. And my main interest really was just to explain what was going on in the data. I was very much more data-driven than Peter, that you heard that he had the great Gerard de Brue driving him into theory. I had applied economists like Lipsey and Archibald and so on driving him into data. And now the official definition of unemployment in the international statistics is one of workers looking for a job and available to take one. And from introspection, we know that if we are without a job, we will look for one, and sooner or later we'll find one. So you might ask, what was at odds between the Phelps-Mortensen view of unemployment, this one of rejecting poor offers, and the one that we see in the official statistics? And the view that I took at the time was that job search in the official definitions and in our intuition is not about looking for a good wage, but about looking for a good job match. Each worker has many distinct features which make them suitable for different kinds of jobs. Job requirements vary across firms too, and employers are not indifferent about the type of worker that they hire at any wage. The process of matching workers to jobs takes time irrespective of the wage offered by each job. This is where search theory has similarities with looking for a partner. When you're looking for a partner, you are not thinking about the monetary payoffs. Hopefully you are not thinking about the monetary payoffs. and that's the idea that was driving me at the time. I was more successful in search theory than in other applications of these ideas, I might say, but anyway. At that time. I felt that the view that the worker is confronted with a wage distribution and she either takes or leaves wage offers is not the best way to think about job search, a process whereby both workers and firms search for each other and jointly either accept or reject the match seemed to me to be much closer to reality. Now I wasn't, and even more so now, that I was dissatisfied both with the purely voluntary view of unemployment, of workers choosing whether or not to work, and with the Keynesian involuntary view, according to which the worker is doing nothing, waiting to be called to a job. It seemed to me that the two-sided matching view of search theory had a better chance of success, both in grounding itself in microeconomic theory and in interpreting the facts about unemployment. It allowed one to study equilibrium models that could incorporate real-world features like differences across workers and jobs, and differences in the institutional structure of labor markets. Now, the step from a theory of search based on the acceptance of a wage offer and one based on a good match is small, but has far-reaching implications for the modeling of the labor market. The reason is that in the case of searching for a good match, we can bring in the matching function as a description of the choices available to the worker. The matching function captures many features of frictions in the labor markets. You've already heard about some of them, that we don't make explicit. It's a black box, as my colleague Barbara Petrongolo and I called it in our survey, in the same sense that the production function is a black box of technology. You don't know what technology is hidden behind the production function, but you know that if you increase capital and labor, you're going to get more output. Same here, if you increase the number of unemployed workers and job vacancies, you're going to get more job matches. The matching function captures the key idea of a good match. It takes time to find a good match. The length of time it takes varies across workers in unpredictable ways. And if there were more job vacancies available, on average, workers could find a good match faster. The same applies to firms looking for workers. The matching function treats workers and firms symmetrically. Now, importantly, because economists are skillful in writing economic models with aggregate functions summarizing complex relationships, it became easy to write models of labor markets with frictions captured by the matching function. It also became possible to estimate these models with real-world data, and in 1986, in a paper published in Economic Policy, I estimated the matching function with encouraging results. I got constant returns to scale, and that sort of opened the door to that kind of modeling. So let's move on to towards that kind of modeling, an equilibrium model. Now, I first used the matching function explicitly in 1979, making it the main building block of an economy-wide model at about the same time that Peter Diamond and Eric Maskin used a similar idea of the search technology. That's the paper that Dale put up in his talk, the title of which he put up. The model of my paper had no wage differentials, but it had different methods of search. And my main interest was to show that with a matching function, one could get an interesting, simple model of equilibrium vacancies and unemployment without a wage distribution. But my 1979 paper still had no theory of wages. Soon after, however, it seemed that all three of us independently realized that since frictions imply that the firm and the worker in a good match enjoy some monopoly power, wages need to share it between them. It helped that in the early 1980s, independent developments in bargaining theory were working out solutions for the splitting of a cake, or a pie, as some people say. And some of the pioneers in that research area were working at the London School of Economics. The big name, I guess, there is Ariel Rubinstein, but the people that influenced me more were my colleagues at the LSE who were influenced by Rubinstein and getting very interested in that kind of thing. People like Ken Binmore, Avner Shackett, John Sutton. And their papers were published at about the same time as mine. Peter's and Dale's papers were published around 1982. Mine a little bit later. So I attempted the derivation of a wage equation in a search model using the ideas that were floated there about in bargaining theory. And the outcomes were some working papers that appeared around 1982, before the electronic era, when information traveled very slowly. And I was unaware, in fact, that Peter was working on similar issues and was 1 or 2 years ahead of me, because my papers were just coming out as discussion papers when his was published in the Review of Economic Studies in '82. I got to hear it when a friend of mine, Yannis Ioannidis, in fact, went to a seminar at MIT. He heard the paper, he sent me Peter's paper and said to me, look, you know, isn't that what you've been talking to me about? And then I also realized that Dale was working on similar kind of bargaining models, using also in the labor market, but also beyond the labor market. So not knowing what to do. In fact, there is an aside here which I didn't mention in the Nobel lecture. I actually hurried finish my paper, sent it to a very distinguished journal for publication. And such was bad luck, the editor turned out to be a friend of Peter's, and he said to me, it's a great paper, we would have published it, but unfortunately it's too close to some work that Peter Diamond is doing, so we can't duplicate work. So I quickly realized that I had to move on to something else, so I moved on to job creation. Now, in Peter's 1982 paper, the problem investigated was that of a fixed number of workers interacting with a fixed number of jobs. That was also very much in line with Dale's independent work published in the same year. Yet when looking at the workings of a real labor market over time, the most striking feature that one sees is how employment and job vacancies fluctuate. In other words, how the total number of jobs varies over time depending on economic conditions. And you saw this very cyclical graph of employment that Dale, I think it was Dale that showed it, yeah. Now, in order to derive a theory of job creation, I made use of the idea that in our models, employment is derived as the sum of distinct units called jobs, and not as an aggregate that can be chosen as a single unit. A job is an asset that is owned by a firm. If it's vacant, it has some value because it can expect to recruit a worker and yield some profit in the future. If it is filled, it's producing for profit. Vacant jobs are like nascent investment projects that have not started yielding a return yet. If their net value is positive, the firm can create them for profit. If it's negative, then the firm is losing money from them, so it makes sense to close them down. It follows that an equilibrium number of jobs could be derived from the condition that the value of a new job vacancy must be zero. I first used the zero profit condition, or free entry condition as is sometimes known, to close the model in my 1984 and especially 85 papers, and it has since become the standard job creation condition in the equilibrium search literature. Combined with the Nash wage equation, it gives an equilibrium wage rate and job creation rate that depend on the frictions as summarized in the matching function and on all the other variables that influence labor market outcomes in standard models, such as productivity and taxes. From this condition, we can get the equilibrium number of vacancies for each unemployed worker, which is called tightness in this literature and is usually denoted by the Greek letter theta. Now, so what we now have is a wage equation and the job creation condition. That gives the diagram that Dale put up and said it's sort of what summarizes our first cut of the model in chapter 1 of my book, as he kindly mentioned. All we need to close the equilibrium, to complete the equilibrium of the model, is the Beverage Curve. Now, you've already heard a lot about the Beverage Curve, which is the relationship between job vacancies and unemployment, so I will not say very much. It was first described by William Beveridge, who was working at LSE in the 1940s, but not actually drawn by him. In fact, I now realize that the best way to have a curve named after you is not to draw it, is to describe it, but hope that someone else will draw it for you. Is that correct? And at the time, in fact, I got interested in the Beverage Curve simply by looking at what other people had done with it in the empirical literature, because one of the original motivations that I had in getting into search theory was to explain an empirical phenomenon about the Beverage Curve that was much discussed in Britain when I was a graduate student, and this was the shift, what was known then the shifting UV curve. UV curve was the name that was given to the Beverage Curve in Britain at that time. And starting sometime in the late 1960s, the British curve had shifted out. And this implied that the labor market had become less good at matching workers to vacant jobs. And there was a long literature asking why. I suspect that the reason for that was partly the transformation from industry to services that was taking place at that time, and also that was the time when unemployment insurance benefits became generous in Britain for the first time. It was the Labour government after the initial reconstruction, after the war. But anyway, there was a great debate about that issue. And here it is, you've seen it before. In the Beverage Curve in this figure. Now, to find the equilibrium unemployment, of course, what you need to know is what point on the Beverage Curve is the economy going to settle. But since I had my value for theta, the ratio of job vacancies for each unemployed worker, all I had to do was to draw a line through the origin, give it slope theta, which is the ratio of vacancies to unemployment, and the point at which that line cut the Beverage Curve is the equilibrium of the economy. Now, at the core of this economy are the frictions that characterize the labor market, and these frictions are the forces that keep the Beverage Curve away from the origin. The frictions could be due to a number of factors, such as the mismatch between the skill requirements of jobs and the skill mix of the unemployed. That's the example of the structural transformation. If the unemployed are in the manufacturing sector, the jobs are in the service sector, there's a friction in moving them from manufacturing to services. It depends, the position depends on the institutional structure of an economy. For example, we sometimes claim that if there are trade unions involved, the Beverage Curve might be further out because the incentive to look for a job for the individual may not be as great, but that's a much more sort of questionable claim, but the claim has been made. And generally, the position of the curve depends on the information available to firms and workers about jobs. Now, the position is also influenced by unemployment insurance, because in an economy where workers do not have strong incentives to accept a job offer quickly because of unemployment insurance, then the Beverage Curve will lie further away from the origin. but policies that support the unemployed during search, but also provide incentives for more intensive job search, can shift the Beverage Curve towards the origin and improve the performance of the labor market in matching workers to jobs. Now, in the latter case, where policy is giving incentives to the worker to look for a job, we say that policy is active. Now, a leader in the implementation of active labor market policies is Sweden, Denmark, and the other Scandinavian countries, who spend far more than other advanced countries on bringing unemployed workers to jobs. In contrast, up to the 1980s, most countries supported the unemployed through passive policies rather than active, with poor outcomes in the recession of the 1980s. But most countries have switched from passive to active policies in the course of the 1990s because of the poor performance of their labor markets in the 1980s. Now, let me now use the information I've just given you to compare two economies, one with more frictions and passive policies for unemployment insurance, with one with fewer frictions and active policies. I think the comparison, yeah, you go, comparing economies over space and time. Here is the diagram that summarizes the comparison. It's a bit messy, but once you get the spirit of it, it's really as clear as mud or crystal. Now, the first economy, which is the one that has more frictions, it's got the Beverage Curve away from the origin, and it also has fewer job vacancies for each unemployed worker because firms expect to take longer to find a vacancy. In the figure that you see compares to such economies, and the economy with more frictions is shown with the broken lines, which has the Beverage Curve that is further away and the job creation line that is further down. So with the bold red lines, you see the equilibrium point of an economy with more frictions. And an important conclusion that you draw from that comparison is that the economy with more frictions will have more unemployment than the economy with fewer frictions, but the two economies may have a similar level of vacancies. You can see the two broken lines that go up to V, they're very, very close to each other, but the unemployment rate is much higher in the red economy than the darker one. Now, this conclusion can be contrasted with the comparison of two economies at different levels of aggregate economic activity, either demand or supply. A lower level of aggregate economic activity simply means that there is less job creation, but not necessarily more mismatch. So job creation will fall, the Beverage Curve will not move, the line through the origin will rotate down, and I show it there as rotating sufficiently down to cut the Beverage Curve where the second set of red letters says economy with lower level of aggregate activity. What you see in that equilibrium is that the level of vacancies is way down and unemployment is way up again. So comparing the economy, one with more frictions and the other with lower level of aggregate demand or aggregate economic activity, you see that it's the different response of vacancies that might be used to differentiate between these two different levels, these two different causes of a rise in unemployment. And my colleagues at LSE, Richard Laird and Richard Jackman, and I we used this idea here in a paper in 1989 to argue that the rise in unemployment in Britain in the 1980s, after the initial surge in it associated with Prime Minister Thatcher's restrictive monetary policy, it took place at more or less constant vacancies. That's not too dissimilar, in fact, from what Peter was claiming that Corcella Cotta was saying, that this mismatch and not aggregate demand. In fact, what happened in Britain in the 1980s is very much what Peter was hinting that maybe is happening now in the United States. There was a big shock in aggregate demand. The manufacturing was almost destroyed because of an appreciation of the exchange rate as well, which is different, of course, from what's happening now in the United States. But then forces of mismatch and more generous unemployment insurance to support the unemployed came in to the British economy at the time, and as a result, that's the Beverage Curve that you got. 1980, more or less, the negative shock ended. The negative shock was really 79-80. You see the line coming down. But from 1980 on, you see something that is the typical response of an economy that I showed you before. Here, the one with the bold red lines, where vacancies are more or less constant and unemployment is rising. And here is the actual path of the economy at that time, where you see this taking place. And therefore, the underlying reasons for the rise in unemployment up to the mid-80s must be ones that are related to various types of frictions in the labor market. And it could be associated with increasing mismatch as the transformation of the economy from an industrial to a service one intensified, and to more generous income support of the unemployed. However, it's also very likely due to the buildup of long-term unemployment, which disillusions the unemployed and damages the incentives that they have to look for work. Long-term unemployment, by which we mean unemployment that lasts for a year or more, is a serious consequence of recession that disenfranchises workers from the labor force. It prolongs the impact that recession has on the quality of the workforce. And it can explain why the unemployment rate was not falling in the 1980s, in 1980s Britain, when the rest of the economy was booming. Governments realized the negative impact of long-term unemployment since then, and they're taking action to control it with rather favorable outcomes. And I would claim that's for this reason that more recent recessions do not exhibit the big shifts in the Beverage Curve and the long persistence of the negative shocks on the labor market that we saw in the 1980s. And we can see this contrast for Britain when we compare the economy's responses to the recession of 2008, which you see here. So this is the response of the British economy to the most recent recession, and this is the response that it had in the previous recession. You can see the contrast. Although there were many reforms that took place in Britain in the 1980s following the recession of the early of that time, since the 1980s, active policy has also played an important role in containing long-term unemployment. And the path of the economy in the Beveridge diagram in the recent recession is a typical example of the response of an economy to a negative aggregate shock. Now, the British experience of the 1980s contrasts sharply with the experience of the United States. Abraham and Katz used unemployment and vacancy data for the United States to argue that the business cycles of the 70s and the 80s were due to aggregate shocks and not sectoral shocks, as argued by David Lillian and others, and most recently by Kocher-Lakota, as you heard. Sectoral shocks would have similar implications to mismatch shocks, but the economy in the United States in the late 1970s and early 80s was tracing a Beveridge curve in the southeastern direction, as implied by an aggregate shock. And here it is. And again, you can contrast the United States here at that time and Britain here. You can see the difference. One could claim that in Britain the shock had sectoral components, but clearly not in the United States, as David Lillian and others have claimed. Now, in the 2008 recession, the US economy started off on a downward path again, but after the initial shock, it traced an increase in unemployment at more or less constant vacancies. And both the previous speakers have talked a lot about that, so I'll also show you my take on this picture. Is the same one you've seen. It's still early days to say what's happening, what's been happening since 2009-4, but it's certainly something very, very interesting. It's also something that policy can deal with, and we had a discussion at the Stockholm School of Economics about policy at that time. That what policymakers should really aim here is to trace a parallel path of the economy up, more or less following the red line that you see. And what they should avoid with policy is something like where the vacancies go up and up, and then you turn in a sort of big loop rather than a parallel line going up. But that's something that will materialize over the next 2 or 3 years. Now, because I'm sure we're coming close to running out of time, so I'm going to skip the next topic, which was going to be wage stickiness, but I do want to say something about job destruction and employment protection legislation, because that summarizes the work that Dale Mortensen and I did more recently. So here it goes. Now, in the original equilibrium model of my 85 paper, the flow into unemployment was assumed to be a constant fraction of employment. And since the model did not have a model of quits and new entry, by implication, the job destruction flow of jobs was also a constant fraction of employment. But soon after the paper's publication, establishment data were published that showed that there are substantial variations in the job destruction flow over time. Both the previous speaker talked about it. They haven't shown you a figure. I can show you here. It is the red line shows the job destruction the destruction of jobs. The blue line shows the creation of jobs. So far, all the theories we've been discussing are about modeling the blue line. And here I'm talking about modeling the red line. Now, when in 1990, the first edition of my second book, Equilibrium and Employment Theory, was published, it again assumed that throughout that the job destruction rate was constant. Essentially, the red line was a flat line. Following the book's publication, Dale wrote a favorable review of the book in the Journal of Monetary Economics, but he pointed out that there is this inconsistency between the assumptions made about job destruction and especially and the evidence that was available, especially by Stephen Davis and John Haltiwanger, who provided. Sorry, no, this is not their data. Sorry, but this is more recent data that I got directly from the United States official sources. But their data are very similar to what you see. This is for the whole economy, whereas their data were for manufacturing. That's why I got this. Now, when Dale's review came out, I was visiting the University of California at Berkeley, and Dale invited me to go to Northwestern to give a talk on the topics of the book. It was summer, so I decided to go. And that, in fact, it was an unbearable summer's day. So that was another aspect of the Chicago weather that I got. How do you manage to live in that place for so many years? I don't know. And that visit brought us together to talk about search for the first time since our Essex days in 1970. And we started a collaboration that lasted for 10 years. And as you can see, we're even friends after the 10 years. We're still friends after 10 years of collaborating on papers. Now, in our analysis of job destruction, we assume that once jobs are created, they cannot easily adapt to new technologies. In the simplest version of the model, they do not adapt at all. So the firm keeps the job going for as long as it is still profitable. When shocks hit that make a job unprofitable, then it's destroyed and the worker is made unemployed, and some new job is created elsewhere to take its place. So what we have really is an economy which a number of jobs that are hit by negative shocks, they close down and new jobs spring up elsewhere in the economy. And the problem is how to move the workers from the jobs that have been destroyed to the jobs that are coming up elsewhere in the economy. Now, we show that like the job acceptance decision in the first generation of search models, the job destruction decision was governed by a reservation productivity. The firm and the worker agreed which jobs to destroy on the basis of their joint real return. And under our rules, most job destruction in the steady state is due to unidentified idiosyncratic shocks, as in the data. But over the cycle, job destruction goes up in recession, usually with a sudden surge of terminations when the news first breaks out, and then goes down in the recovery phase. And this introduces cyclicality in both the job creation and job destruction rates, along the lines that you see in this graph here. Now, the variable job destruction rate has implications for the dynamics of unemployment in the Beverage Curve, but it does not affect the dynamics of the job creation rate that I showed you earlier. It also implies that there is no incentive to search on the job and move from one job to another without experiencing unemployment. The reason is that workers have an incentive to leave the jobs that are becoming obsolete or have low profitability for other reasons. Now, the full model is set out in the second edition of my book, which I wrote after we developed these models. But rather than discuss the full model, I'll discuss the implications of employment protection legislation for unemployment and job flows, because it's one policy whose study needs the extended model with variable job destruction. Because the aim of employment protection legislation is to make job destruction more difficult for the firm, with the objective of securing a longer lasting employment spell for the worker. Now, although all advanced countries, although all advanced countries exercise some kind of employment protection, there are large variations in the type of restrictions implemented, and there are also big differences in the severity across countries. And at the risk of oversimplifying, we know from the OECD that the southern European countries have much stricter employment protection legislation than the northern countries, and especially than the United States and the United Kingdom. I will discuss here the restrictions on dismissals that take the form of administrative procedures that cost the firm time and money. These can be represented in our models as a pure tax paid by the firm at the time of dismissal. A tax on dismissals reduces job separations for obvious reasons. Some low productivity jobs that would have been destroyed before the imposition of the tax will now not be destroyed, as the firm reduces its reservation productivity to reduce the chances that it might have to pay the tax. So one implication of employment protection legislation is that the size of the flow into unemployment is lower than otherwise. But average labor productivity is also lower, and wages should also be lower to compensate the firm for the tax and lower productivity. Now, another important impact of employment protection legislation is on job creation. Intuitively, when the firm is creating a job, it expects to have to pay the tax in some future date if it has to dismiss the worker. And as a result, job creation falls. So just like the flow into unemployment, the flow out of unemployment at given unemployment also falls. The net impact on unemployment depends on which flow falls more. You saw the graph that Peter showed, where the Mediterranean countries were concentrated in the origin in their flows, whereas the United States and Scandinavia and the United Kingdom were way out. Employment protection legislation could explain that. It's correlated with that, with those differences that you saw. Now, the net impact on employment, however, it depends on which flow falls more. If the flow into unemployment falls more than the flow out, then unemployment would fall. Sorry, if the flow into unemployment falls more, the unemployment would fall. That's the right way, and vice versa. Now, empirical work shows that the impact of employment protection legislation on unemployment is very small and can go either way, but the size of the flows falls. There is less labor and job turnover, lower average labor productivity, and longer durations of both unemployment and employment. In extended versions of our models with training, the longer durations of employment might encourage more training, which is considered to be one of the few advantages, I guess, of employment protection legislation. As workers are willing to spend more money and time in getting trained if they know that they will keep the job for longer periods of time. And in yet other extended versions with different kinds of workers, employment protection legislation tends to benefit primary workers, who are usually men over the age of 25, but hurts other workers like women and youths who go in and out of the labor force at more frequent intervals. Let me now move to the final 3 or 4 minutes. Where do we go next in this theory? Well, search and matching theory has come a long way since the three of us, with others who collaborated with us or worked independently, formulated the first models 30 years ago. A recent book by Brian and John McCall that surveys the economics of search is 550 pages long, and I understand from the authors that there was going to be a second volume that would have all the things that were left out. But there's still a lot to do. We have discovered, just like Sir John Hicks did in 1932, one of the great economists, great British economists of the time, that what he discovered was that the theory of wages is key to understanding the functioning of labor markets. Sir John described in detail how frictions in labor markets, mobility costs, and trade unions and other institutions influence wages, and how wages influence employment, very much along the lines that modern theory describes. But modern theory has still to explore more fully the role of institutions in its formal models. Of course, Hicks didn't have a formal model of the labor market. It was a very good description that he had. And this is an area of research that should attract a lot of attention in the future. First and second points that you see there. Now, I did not have time to talk about wage stickiness very much, but wage stickiness is still as important an issue for macroeconomics as it has ever been. And markets with frictions open up many more possibilities for wage stickiness in future, as Bob Hall and Robert Scheimer have indicated in their recent publications. And future research needs to explore these issues. Now, the recent financial crisis has also thrown open doors that we thought were firmly closed not so long ago. Our models were built on the assumptions of rational expectations and perfect capital markets. In our models, even the unemployed can borrow unlimited sums of money to finance their consumption and job search. Now, these are good starting assumptions, and they have yielded important results, but future work needs to explore other assumptions about expectations and knowledge, something that Dale and Peter also pointed out. It needs to introduce imperfect capital markets, and it needs to integrate the financial sector with the labor market, because what we're now seeing is that the shocks are taking place in the financial sector, but they're affecting the labor market in ways that it's not really obvious how they can be analyzed yet. We need to think about that more carefully within the structure of the models. And this might one day explain how shocks get amplified to the extent that we see in the data, because we do see a lot of amplification of shocks within the labor market and how they impact on unemployment. So although progress has been rapid since the early 1980s, when our models were first formulated, I feel that we can look forward to more interesting research within the search and marching framework that these models have initiated. And of course, most of that interesting research will come from PhD students, just like it came in the 1960s and 70s. Thank you very much.